It's a great pleasure to be with you today at LLF, the Lahore Literary Festival, a young festival that already commands a loyal following, and certainly one of my personal favorites. I'm only sorry that we can't be in Lahore in person. It is a privilege to introduce today's event, a conversation between Kamila Shamsie and Hisham Matar. Now, I doubt that there's anybody attending here who doesn't know exactly who these two writers are and hasn't read them and isn't aware of their stature and their achievement. They're very distinct writers, but they have important features in common. Both work in both fiction and non-fiction. Both have produced a substantial body of work, and both have won awards at the beginning of their careers and very recently. Hisham Matar, starting with the Guardian First Book Award for In the Country of Men in 2006, to the Pulitzer in 2017 for The Return. Kamila Shamsie, in 1999, the Prime Minister's Award for Literature in Pakistan for this In the City by the Sea. 2018, the Women's Prize for Fiction for Home Fire, and 2019, the Nelly Sachs Prize, which we must mention because it was rescinded by the German city of Dortmund because of Kamila's support for the BDS movement for Palestinian rights. The last feature that they have in common, which I'll mention here, is that like so many of you, of us here tonight, they call many places home, but live an ongoing engagement with the first home, an engagement that informs their work, I think. So let's have the pleasure of listening to Kamila and Hisham in conversation.
Hisham.
Hello, Kamila.
Hello. It's very nice to see you across the screen.
Very good to see you. Yeah.
What weird times these are. I really wish we were in Lahore together, which is a wonderful city, and I would take you around and show you sights and make you eat many wonderful things. So let's promise we'll do that one day when the world allows it again.
I would love that. There are several reasons why I want to go to Pakistan, but chief amongst them is our relationship and the things that you have shown me about Pakistan and the way that I feel that I know it without having never gone there or know a sense of it. So yes, one day I hope so, very much.
It's funny to hear you say you have a sense of knowing it without having been there, because Hisham, before you and I became friends, I was a fan. So when your first book was published, I was sent it by The Guardian to review. And I remember reading it. And for those of you who haven't yet read In the Country of Men, you should all read it. Oh, by the way, hello, Lahore, and wherever else you're listening. It's very nice to be among you in some way. But yes, Hisham's first book, In the Country of Men, has a 9-year-old protagonist and is set in, you know, on one hand, you could say perhaps Hisham thinks it's Libya during the time of Colonel Gaddafi. But while I was reading it, I felt so strongly a sense of growing up in Zia-ul-Haq's Pakistan. And I felt this person who I haven't met knows me, knows the country I'm from, because I suppose all dictatorships must have some things in common. And it was a really extraordinary novel. And in some ways, I feel the basis of our friendship has been, you know, we started as I was a reader of your book, and then you were a reader of my review. And in what seemed to me a very Pakistani moment, the first time we met, you, instead of saying to me, I liked your review, or what you said to me was, my mother really liked your review. And I understood that was far more meaningful than you actually.
Yes, no, that review was quite an event for us. And I remember the moment very clearly when we went to a cafe and sat outside. And my mother asked me to read it to her. And then after the coffee said, do you mind reading it again? So, yeah, so it was quite very memorable. But also I think, you know, I felt very similarly reading your work. You know, I felt a sense of connection and recognition. And it seems both moving and deeply humbling that this is then another layer is added to this event today by having Ahdaf Suwaif introduce us, because I had that relationship with her work and felt that thing that you describe, you know, when you, and maybe it is the most powerful experience in reading, when you find yourself, you know, or you come upon yourself in a world that you assumed was different from yours. And maybe you also assumed that you were the only one who felt these little private moments, and someone else reveals it in a way that's so intimately recognizable. So I think the paradox actually about reading is that, I'm sure you were told this too when you were a kid, you know, when we're encouraged to read, you're always told to read so you can learn about others and learn about things you don't know, which is of course true. It happens occasionally. But I think what is more memorable, more powerful, more moving is when you come upon yourself, really, or you come upon things that have happened to you. Very, very powerful. And I felt that very strongly in your work. Tell me about...
No, you're not asking the questions. Look at you.
No,
you're turning the interlocutor.
I can't ask a question.
You can ask. I want to say that I completely agree about that sense of recognition. And of course, it's there with Ahdaf's work, and she is a hero in so many ways
Yes.
to me. But yes, that recognition also, I mean, I think when I was growing up, we were, you know, so much of my reading, because I was reading in English, was sort of England, America, and places like that. And so then to read writers like you and Ahdaf, and to have a sense of actually these many different kinds of connections and layers that are in the world around us are a powerful thing. But I want to actually, before you get into asking me questions, I want to go to the question of language, because I was reading something you wrote where you were talking about your early relationship to Arabic, and how the two things you loved when you were a very young child was swimming and Arabic.
Yes.
Tell me about the Arabic language in you. What is it? You know, I think one thing of knowing more than one language is you get to understand more clearly what one does that others don't do.
Yes.
Tell me what the Arabic language means and meant to you.
I mean, two events happened in succession, and for a long time I didn't see them as connected because they don't seem so evidently connected. But they were to me very much, which is that we left Libya, and left in a way that felt final to me, or at least going to be the case for a long time, until the political regime changes. And even though my parents were very hopeful that that would happen at any moment, I somehow, I don't know why, because I was very little, you know, I was 9 years old when we left, but I somehow knew it was going to be for a very long time, maybe forever. I somehow knew it. And then a few years into the new life in Egypt, our time coincided with a moment that was quite interesting, I think, in Egyptian history, contemporary history, because it was the moment when, for a series of complicated reasons, the government almost abandoned the education system in Arabic, didn't fund it, didn't support it enough. And it had been going into decline already, but from that moment on, really the early 1980s saw a very severe decline in the quality of the education. Sorry, don't want to get into all that history, but all that to say that anyone who could afford it sent their kids to English, French, or German schools. This happened on such a scale that now the majority of the intelligentsia, the upper middle classes in Egypt, had an education that was outside of Arabic. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Anyway, I was one of those people that was dragged out of Arabic school, and for me, reluctantly. I had none of the, you know, I wasn't excited about going to English school. I really, the Arabic language I had a very powerful love affair with it. I also felt very uncomfortable in this American school with all these American kids who seemed to have very rigid or oversimplified ideas about me and about Egypt and about Cairo. And I had a very strong love with the language, but also a love for the city. And that wasn't shared by my peers. So I felt very much an outsider amongst all of that, you know. And had, you know, went from not speaking a word of English to sitting in a booth with headphones in the morning, listening to Jane Austen for 3 hours with the book in front of me and losing my. That's how I learned, basically. That was the first. And Bob Marley and Bob Dylan. Those two helped also learning the English. So I felt it wasn't a natural sort of transition.
How old were you at this point?
I was 11 or 12. And then I had to work very hard to get it, you know, to get the language. And then came to England to school when I was 15. And then by then, really, I was operating only in that language. And
I want to know what your relationship with Jane Austen is as a result of that early encounter. Did it put you off her?
Not at all. I love Jane Austen. I think, you know, I strangely found I found solace in her in this very strange situation. I found comfort in her. And I think she's wonderful. And then, you know, gradually this sort of very strong and sincere love affair with the English language developed. It's a very different relationship. You know, I remember really worrying about all this. You know, it weighed heavily on me, particularly when I started to write. You know, and particularly, you know, when I got to England and I was at school and I was sending letters home. I noticed that my father and I exchanged letters on a regular basis, even when we were in the same house. It was just something we did. And so when I went to school, I kept writing these letters. And yet he just didn't respond after a few letters. And then this big envelope came with all of my letters, 4 or 5 letters I had sent him. And with just one note in Arabic written said, "You wish to write me? Write in Arabic." And after that, I thought, I'm not going to write you. That's it. You know? So it was you know, always complicated, the subject. But when I started to write and I wanted to write, it became such a big thing. And at that moment, I had the very good fortune of meeting Naguib Mahfouz in Cairo. And I didn't really want to ask him this question, but I did. I asked him, I said, how do you see people like me and all these wonderful writers now that are writing in other languages, Hadaf Suwaif, and you know, and before, you know, Wagih Ghali, and you know, how do you see those people? And he said what I didn't want to hear, but I needed to hear. He said, "You belong to the language that you write in." And then when he saw that I was disappointed, he said, "But who cares?" Then who cares? And then he said something that I think is really beautiful and very true, which is that you belong, you know, the language is your river, you know. It has, so just by writing in English, you're not somehow sort of, you know, just writing in English. You're writing in a tradition. You're having to respond to all of the writers that have come before, that have made this language what it is, you know.
Yeah.
So
and for you, I know
really
a lot of the writers who I think touch in movie. I mean, yes, there's someone like Virginia Woolf who is very English, but also writers like Nabokov, Conrad, Brodsky. These sort of emigre writers, or writers who grew up in one language and one land and moved to another. They're quite important to you, aren't they?
They are. I mean, Conrad and Woolf are particularly important to me. And Woolf, of course, when she wrote the obituary for Conrad, whom she admired greatly.
I didn't know that.
She called him our guest. So even after 35 years of living here and writing all these incredible masterpieces, there are very few writers really that have written 5 masterpieces, you know, and Conrad is one of those, very unusual. unusual talent. But he also was, he was all right being it. He was strangely determined to remain a guest, you know. So she was both maybe a little bit unfair and also accurate at the same time. But yeah, no, those are, and I think it's something maybe to do also with the character of the language, you know, that it does invite people who want to mess with it, you know. And Virginia Woolf was very very unconventional in the way that she constructed those sentences. Very strange. Her language is very unusual. Yeah.
One of the interesting things with your languages is you have such a strong sense of the aesthetic and you know, language is art, but also you had from quite an early age, didn't you, the sense that words can be dangerous.
Yes. Yeah.
Tell me more about the idea of words as dangerous things and how early that became evident to you.
Well, I think this is something that would sadly be familiar to you. You know, it's sort of, you know, anyone who has grown up in a contested moment, you know, politically contested moment where families are sliced in half, and their allegiance is complicated by it, and they have to accommodate all of these silences, you know, in their daily life. You know, that sort of exercise of tiptoeing around certain words, you know, and also you know, it's implicit that there are a whole set of things that are said that you shouldn't repeat, you know. I remember this story about this man in Libya who had a dream that he had murdered Gaddafi. He woke up in the morning and over breakfast with his wife and his 2 kids, how did you all sleep? Did you have any dreams? Libyans are fascinated with dreams. They're always talking about their dreams. And so yeah, I had a really interesting, very strange dream. And he told the dream to his family. One of the kids innocently went off and repeated this dream to his friends. Eventually, the man got arrested for having the dream, you know? So all of these things were around you all the time. And so you knew that listening was a very complicated activity. That you had to you're a custodian of small bombs, you know, and that you have to handle them with great care. And of course, I think everybody has this experience. Of course, this is an extreme example of it, but I think anyone growing up in a family is initiated into, you know, the world of the sayable and the unsayable, you know, the things that, you know, and I don't think literature is possible without that. I mean, that's why it's, yeah.
When you started to... Okay, go on. What's your question?
Was that something that you grew up feeling? Yeah. Very
much. And I remember particularly phone calls. There was always a sense that someone else could be listening in on a phone call. Yes. And so that you wouldn't say anything that was dangerous or contentious. And I remember learning this very, very early on, that particularly sort of political events and things you didn't want to directly allude to. And also this idea that the home was safe. You know, there was, you know, I didn't grow up, I know in other periods of Pakistan's history, there's been a sense that, you know, someone you know could be informing, but I grew up with the sense that people's homes were safe, but that outdoor spaces and public spaces, you had to be much more careful in terms of how you're communicating and what you're saying. And, you know, I don't think that has completely gone from Pakistani life at all. But I'm interested in how that plays in when you are sitting down to write. So when you sat down to write in The Country of Men, and, you know, Gaddafi is still very much in power in Libya, and there's no sense of that going away. And did you have a sense of any worry or concern, maybe not in a logical way, but at some level that childhood sense of words and danger coming through as you're sitting down to write a novel that is, you know, at heart about what it is to grow up in that kind of repressive regime?
Very much, very much. And I didn't really have a kind of, I didn't have a grown-up solution to it. I sort of, in the absence of bravery, I find self-delusion is really very, very useful. So I just sort of told myself, no one will read it, and I'll just keep writing. Something interesting happens, I think, that happens in anything, like in any work, regardless of its subject, because I think every work, even if it's about something, that isn't sort of so nakedly dangerous, like writing about, about a regime or something. In the situation I was writing in, to call the dictator a dictator was a crime punishable, by death. That was the crime of calling Gaddafi a dictator. So just by writing that is a problem. So all these, and then also there were things that I was writing about that they weren't necessarily only dangerous to write about, but we as a society covered up, because there were moments of national psychosis. When people went crazy and did horrible things. It's, no one likes to think about it. No one likes to remember it. And the other very important thing is that you're also trying not to write about it. You don't want to write a novel that is just a list of these things. That's not the kind of novel you want to write. So you want to find a space of freedom where you could write about it without obligation to write about it or the obligation not to write about it. And that was probably the most difficult thing to strike. But I think any book is involved in an act of transgression, even if it doesn't want it. It's going to overstep something. It's just something about the nature of it. And so what I found is that as the book accumulates, in the beginning, it is still affected by your taste, by your anxieties, by your opinions. It's still, and then there's this wonderful moment that happens when the balance shifts and you are subject to its fate and to its tastes and its preoccupations. You start to become more like a servant to it. And at that stage, really, it asserts itself, in a way that helps you, strangely, helps you sort of forget about the other things. But, I never stopped worrying about them.
Yeah. I wonder whether it felt in some way emotionally or psychologically dangerous. I mean, I think, Hisham, a lot of people here will know some of the biographical details of your life, but for those who don't, I mean, you left Libya at 9. Your father was in Cairo in opposition to Gaddafi, and so there was many years when things were quite dangerous and fraught. And then in 1990, he was basically picked up and disappeared, and he went to Abu Salim prison and then silence for many years, and the sort of silence that continued. And I wondered whether when you sat down to write that first book, which is in some sense, it's not autobiographical, but it takes elements certainly of your life, this 9-year-old in this fraught political situation. Did it feel, as I said, did it feel emotionally dangerous to go there in fiction?
I mean, yes. I mean, there were moments in it when, I remember there were moments that were very difficult. I don't know if it was the writing of it or what I was going through, vis-a-vis all this stuff that you mentioned, or whether the book was involving me more deeply into that area. You more than most people know what that was like for me. In fact, you helped me so much with the campaign that we had for my father. You were one of the leading figures of it, and so it's a subject that's very much got me from the majority of my life. But also, beside all this, and this is the hard thing to describe, beside all of that, there is just that writer that you've recognized in yourself way before you could admit it to anyone.
Yeah.
and who was finding his way out. And he can't do it, at least the kind of writing I'm interested in, the kind of writer I want to be. You know, he couldn't have come out without passing through all of that fire, you know, and writing about, attending to this stuff, you know, in some way. So it was both dangerous, but also exhilarating, because the hunter in you can smell it. You know, you could smell, you know, the exit in some way. You know, of course, you never exit, but you could smell something, kind of whatever the opposite of impotence is. You know, because that's what that situation makes you feel.
Yeah.
You know, when your father disappears and you can't find him, and no one acknowledges that he was kidnapped, no one acknowledges that he's there. But also cousins, uncles in prison. A friend of mine, I've never written about this, but a friend of mine who was killed in prison. On all of the accumulating effects of all of that, plus the stuff we were talking about before, you know, all the silences, all of the fear. I mean, there is a particular indignity, I think, to growing up under a dictatorship that is very difficult to describe to somebody who hasn't been through it. You know, it really does get into the quiet hours. You know, it's not just, you can't speak about it only in terms of the, you know, the big kind of political gestures, you know, what is banned, what is not allowed, how many people are in prison. That's not enough for you to get anywhere close to what it's like, because you could be totally unscathed by all of those things, but it still gets to your dignity in some way. It gets to a certain kind of quality of fear. Something in you is broken by it, and you know, to try to attend to that is tricky, and you feel as if you're being submerged. You know, you're being drowned by history, by events, and so. One of the things that I find interesting about writing is that it's running in the opposite direction. You know, it's all about emergence. You know, about a state of emergency. You know, as Walter Benjamin put it. You know, it is a state. You know, he was very interested in this moment where things come up. You know, and how you attend to them, and do you then treat them with the same kind of domineering gesture of employing them towards your whatever it is causes are, or do you just attend to them, allow them to resonate, you know, just for what they are, you know, as things lost?
I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that in international law, it's recognized that when a person is disappeared, that his or her family are being subject to torture, that it is a form of torture that you are being put through as the family. So it's not just about what is done to the disappeared, but to those who love the disappeared.
Yes, yeah. I mean, actually, the genius of the law is that it deems exactly what you said, the families as being subjected to torture, but also it goes further. You know, it goes further and it says that the person who was ordered to disappear the person was also tortured, right, by the order. So it's very complex. Yeah, it's very complex.
One of the things that I know you started to do in that year when your father was disappeared, you were 20, weren't you? It was 1990. And
I was 19, yeah, just about to be 20.
And you were in England, and you started to go to the National Gallery, one of the great places of the world, at lunchtime and sit and look at art. Why do you think you did that? Why did art become important in this moment?
Well, I mean, from this perspective, it seems to make sense, doesn't it? That at a moment when you're subjected to an inconclusive disappearance, but a disappearance also that imposes a certain level, because if you do, you might subject him to more danger, or you know, it's like it clouded the event in silence. So it seems to make sense that that moment of disappearance, that I went to the appearing, world of art, which I was interested in before, but the event, my father's disappearance, coincided with this sort of great unease I would feel in a museum. It's very strange. I'd feel very nervous and overwhelmed. Can't wait to get out. Never wanted to go, but I like art, and so I thought I need to devise a strategy, and the strategy was to use the privilege of the free entry to go to the museum every day, but only for 20 minutes. So, have my sandwich there and leave. And because it was only there for 20 minutes, I'll only look at one painting. And I thought it was a strategy for a limited time to sort of cure me out of my restlessness in the museum. But it has become now, 30 years later, I still do the same thing. I don't go every day, but I go 2-3 times a week, to it. And what I found is that it really does become, it's like this extended conversation that you have with a piece of work, and at that moment particularly, they're still that, but at that moment they seemed so available. They were really the opposite of the situation I was in, a situation of disappearance and inavailability, and these were totally available, appearing, eloquent, very generous, like all great works of art. They're the most generous locations because they're a space of concentrated human activity. And, the kind of human activity, the amount of ideas and emotional life and psychology that none of us can hold in 1 minute. It's impossible. But this painting has just absorbed it, and it's just there, and it's there for you to go look at. And so I found it so, again, going back to those instances of the opposite of impotence, it was a moment of great eloquence. And, and it turns out I still need that. They're just wonderful. Yeah.
Is it true that you go and revisit the same painting for months and months, maybe up to a year at a time? That once you...
Yes, then when I start...
Yeah. Sorry, go.
Yes, yeah, sorry. Yes, when I started, it was only for a week. It was almost mechanical. 1 week, and then next week, and then it started to stretch a bit. Now it takes me a long time. Now it takes, months, usually a year. But to explain, I'm not doing nothing else. I'm not looking. I'm looking at that painting, but I am also looking at other things. Quickly, maybe on the way in and the way out. But it's that painting that I am attending to.
Tell me some of the paintings you've recently attended to for that kind of stretch of time.
There is a painting at the most recent is last year I was looking at a painting by a French painter, Baroque French painter called Nicolas Poussin, and the painting is called Dance to the Music of Time. It's a very famous painting. You could Google it and find it. It's at the Wallace collection, Dance to the Music of Time. It's very beautiful, but it's also a little essay on what is time, what is the circularity, connectedness, and fragmentation of time. And so it is delightful to look at, but also so interesting. And in the same place, actually, the year before, I was looking at a painting by Rembrandt that he painted of his son, Titus. It's called, I think it's just called Titus. Rembrandt, who was famous of painting his self-portrait. This is a portrait of his son. And it's so interesting because you see this loop that's happening, because the son is obviously not so, he's being generous to his father, but he's not, this is not what he really wants to do. He wants to go out into the world. And so what you're seeing is him satisfying his father and his father finding a way into him to get his spirits on the painting. Really interesting. And more recently, before this lockdown that we are under, I was looking at a set of paintings by Titian, who's a Italian Renaissance painter, who painted a set of paintings inspired by myth of Actaeon and Diana, Ovid's rendition of it. So these are pieces that just have a lot of layers in them. So they need time. Yeah.
Anyone who's wondering why I'm talking to Hisham so much about art is because his most recent book, A Month in Siena, is really about a month in Siena and these relationships with art. And you wrote it at an interesting moment, didn't you? Because you had finished the nonfiction book, The Return, which was about going back to Libya in that period of great hope, just post-revolution. And so you had finished the book, and there's always that feeling of satisfaction when the book has been finished, but it's not yet published. So you don't yet have to contend with people's demands or people's views of it. So there was that moment of satisfaction, but you also talk about how, once that trip was done and you had been to Libya and returned, there was that increasing recognition that you would probably almost inevitably never know what really happened to your father. And in this strange moment, you went to Siena for a month. Why did you go to Siena for a month?
Well, again, I thought I was going for one reason. It turns out I was going for that reason, yes, but also something else that I didn't know about. I was going because The Return was a book that I felt was, written out of my veins. It was very, very, very intense writing that book, and it's a book that demanded great patience towards things that make me terribly impatient, and demanded me to go to very dark places. And once I finished, I thought I want pleasure. I get pleasure from the work too, but a different kind of pleasure. I wanted, and also it was at a moment when I was counseling myself that I should take my pleasures more seriously. Which might come as a surprise to you. Most of my friends know how seriously I take my pleasures, but I thought, no, I should take it even more seriously. and so I thought I want to do something pleasurable, and I went to Siena because these paintings that were painted in Siena, so-called the Sienese school, 12th, 13th, 14th century, so just before the Renaissance, and just after the influence of the Eastern Church. And so it's a very interesting moment because it was very porous, and Tuscany was looking out, believed that the interesting stuff was happening elsewhere. And I think most interesting places are places that feel that way. And they're less provincial for it. And so they created these paintings that I've always found fascinating, and couldn't understand why I found them fascinating, because they're very religious, paintings, and I'm not Christian, and I don't have a particular interest in those kind of paintings. So I couldn't understand why I was, that was one reason. The other reason is that they're very formal and very kind of old. And anyway, I wanted to go to Siena to engage more deeply with them, and maybe to find out why I'm so fascinated by them. And it's true, that's what I went and did. And it was wonderful, and those paintings are incredible. And but it turned out also that I'd gone to mark the inescapable, really, after having looked for him everywhere and tried my best, the inescapable fact that my father is dead, and that I will probably have to live the rest of my life not knowing where, how, when, not having a grave, not having his remains. That seemed to me inescapable at that moment, and I needed to mark it. And none of the things that well-intentioned friends suggested made sense. Whether you sort of, I don't know, plant a tree or do, I don't know. And I didn't know, so I didn't go with the intention of marking anything, but I realized that I was, I needed a space to mourn. I think that's what it was, marking in that way. I needed to mourn, and I needed to mourn alone in my own way. I find the grief of people I love unbearable, and I step into a mode of wanting to comfort them, and I didn't want to have to comfort anyone. I wanted to yeah. So that was a surprise. I didn't know that came on me when I was there, in a way that was very powerful. And there were, again, those paintings always, every day.
What struck me about A Month in Siena, which I just reread with great pleasure last night, was the word and the emotion that seems to be in there more than anything else isn't despair or sorrow, it's love. There's just such profound love everywhere in that book, which is incredibly moving. And I expect to a lot of people surprising, because it would be so easy, I think, to imagine that despair might be the space in which that book was written.
No, that pleases me to hear you say that, because it's just something I do think it's it's a cliche thing to say, but I do think it's the most important thing, I also think that we go about thinking, or I do, I think most of us do, go about saying things that we don't know. Most of the things that we think we know, we don't actually know them at all. We've been told them, or they've been reported to us. I think, the nature of human existence is such that it is very difficult to know things, to really know something. And if you've ever known something, if you've ever learned one thing really well, you know how little that you know. And so love also in that sense, in the sense that notwithstanding all of the horrible, things that have happened, I've known something, I've known a person, and I've known what it's like to love them and what it's like to be loved by them. I've known that, and I've also known what it's like to lose them. So there's something about, I think, that thing that T.S. Eliot says about writing is involved in rescuing things from oblivion. I think I keep coming back to it, because I think there's something really true about it. That one of the things that happens in writing is that you are trying to snatch things, just from the edge of silence, or the edge of your own memory, or your own sense of things.
I want to take you back, Hisham, to 2011, which was a quite extraordinary year. It was the year that your novel Anatomy of a Disappearance was published, which is, they're all extraordinary books, all of them. And Anatomy of a Disappearance starts with, a teenage boy, and, he goes to live with his father, and he's sort of infatuated with the woman his father ends up marrying. And then the father disappears, and a lot of it is to do with that disappearance. And the book was obviously written earlier in a different kind of world. And when it was published, the Arab Spring was in full flow, and the revolution in Libya was on. And I remember so powerfully spending time with you at that moment. I remember there was a day which was, it was sort of a bleak period in Pakistan's history, and you were so filled with hope and optimism. And it was, you were showing me videos of poems being read out, that someone had written a poem, and within days everyone knew this poem and was reciting it in Benghazi and other places. And I wonder how that hope sits with you now, that sense of hope and optimism you felt then. Do you think of it now as false and deceitful, or do you think of it as a promise of what's still possible, or something else entirely?
No, I think of it as a moment that exposed the, it was a very complicated moment because it was a moment that was in resistance to oppression, but it also, by its nature and what happened afterwards, exposed the depth of the problem, the depth of the problem for example, if we just focus on Libya, we thought that the objective was to overthrow the dictator. We didn't realize that it was to overthrow the dictator and build a state. Overthrowing a dictator seems difficult, but it's much easier than building a state. Also, I think these moments like what happened in Tunisia, what happened in Egypt, so we are clear, I still think they were moments of great nobility. They were truly phenomenal. The moment when ordinary people go out on the street and face inexplicable, unspeakable danger and threat to call for a different kind of reality. It was so beautiful, and we, it's easy now to forget, but it really lit us all up. It really, the mystics. I'm not, of course, a mystic, and I'm not definitely enlightened at all. But the mystics, I like their writings in all the traditions. In the Muslim tradition, the Christian tradition, Judaic. I just like there are certain books that I find very interesting, and all of them speak about the glimpse. A moment when you see, on the way to enlightenment, you see these glimpses, and then they get shrouded by other things. And I see that moment as that, it was a moment when we really could see that whatever it is that was connecting the individual to society to the state became exposed, and we could see the dynamism, and we could see the potential and the ambition. And lots of people who had no voice found a voice, so that I still, just to sort of make it clear, I still think that is a beautiful moment. And I do also think that we need to approach the lament that now you get a lot. I'm talking India, in those countries, in Egypt, in Libya, and Tunisia, to some extent. The lament that a lot of people are engaging in. We need to approach it with great sensitivity and complexity, I think, that, it is understandable, right? I mean, it's really horrible if you've ever lived in a place where there's sudden political disintegration, it's very, very uncomfortable and horrible. So it's understandable, but also I think there are some gestures in it that I'm less sympathetic to, that are to do with a kind of self-loathing, oh, we never deserved this anyway. Who did we think we were to want to, there's that sort of, or, one side looks at the other side, those people, right, suddenly, those people, so there's that kind of language and that kind of sort of suggestions of self-loathing, I think are also, I'm less sympathetic to, but I'm also interested in, because I think the moment that you have a foreign boot fall onto your soil, it's a very complicated moment, and it leaves you really harmed and fractured, and that, so moments like that, when you have a revolution like that, all the symptoms of the past come up, all the, what the occupation, the partition, the fragmentation, the dictatorship, the civil war, all of those past chapters are really, really, really enlivened. And when you look at a country like Libya, those chapters are numerous and complex, and in a very short period of time. We've had a lot of things happen. So yes, so I look at it as in that light, as a kind of exposure of historical symptoms, and the present too.
I could carry on talking to you forever, but I think I have only time to ask you one more question, and this is to do with the return. Again, sort of extraordinary novel of your going back and trying to search for answers to your father, but also going back. Is it for the first time since you were 9 years old to Libya?
Yeah.
And there is a line from that book, which has probably been quoted more than any other, so you may be sick of it. But you write about some of the writers you've read, and you said, you talk about Brodsky, Nabokov, and Conrad, and you said each had tried to cure himself of his country. And I wonder whether that is a cure you have managed or that you are interested in.
I'm not sure. That's a very good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think what I am sure of is that before all of this, through it, and to the present, I am much more interested in other forms of being. In other words, I don't think of myself in relationship to my country in some sense. I mean, I evidently care a great deal about it, but I don't. Yeah. So, but so I don't know. But I feel with everything that has happened to us. I think the Russians were right. It's inescapable. The Americans were wrong. This idea that you remake everything and you are born and the slate is wiped clean. No, we are inheritors we're born into the aftermath. We really are. But it seems to me that within that, there's a range, there's a wide repertoire, maybe not so wide, but there is definitely a repertoire of how you respond to the past, how you engage with it, how you subject yourself to it or not, and it's in that area that I am searching for the cure, I suppose.
Thank you, Hisham.
Yeah. Thank you, Kamila. Thank you so much. And to everyone, and to Hadaf, and to the organizers, and to everyone listening. I hope next time we will meet in person in Pakistan. I look forward to that.
So do I. And I think we have the pleasure of Hadaf returning to our screens before we all exit.
That was extraordinary. I feel enormously privileged to have been listening to this. I feel tremendously moved. I was taking notes because I feel I have so much to think about. What questions and what responses. It was so generous, so honest, so profound, luminous. Thank you so very, very much. Kamila Shamsie, Hisham Matar. It's a privilege listening to you. Thank you.